right, you admirable, you damnable accursed. Welcome to 3/4 of a podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that I'm here this week. Kory Teneycke is here. Scott Reid is here. But Jordan Leichnitz, alas, has gone pod AWOL. She's temporarily packed up her progressive politics and her Frederick Ebert Stiff-Tongue Institute program officer and Canadian liaison skills, and now there's a vacuum here, a vast, unfillable void. Don't panic, accursed. She still loves us. She'll be back in a couple of weeks. But today on the pod with Scott and Kory, the Trudeau Poilievre verbal wars continue. How is it all playing politically? We'll break it down with John Ibbotson's piece in the Globe, leading us into our discussion as our cursed clipping. We'll turn our attention to Liberal Ontario, maybe now with a tinge of green, and the letter signed by 39 veteran Liberals pleading with Mike Schreiner to cross the floor and seek their leadership. Smart move, dumb move, desperate move. We'll dive into that. And then with mounting violence on the subway and elsewhere in Toronto, the politics of crime. At that point, the venerable Gordon Pinson arrives, and so do our Hey Yous. Scott, Kory, how you doing?
Great.
Not bad.
You guys would have been real proud of me. I went to a Habs game with Jenny on Saturday night. That's something I don't normally do, but it was in Ottawa, so of course there were about 4 Habs jerseys for every one Senators jersey. Sadly, it didn't help your Habs at all.
No, actually, it was the Laval Rocket. I think the Ottawa Senators beat the Laval Rocket of the American Hockey League. That's who the Canadians are putting on the ice these days. Scott, I feel for your Niners. You can't win without a quarterback. It's very difficult.
It was a pretty grim weekend sports-wise. We were corresponding with Jenny during that game. That game got so bad that my 13-year-old son, who cannot be discouraged when it comes to all things Habs, got up in the halfway through the second period and said, "Piss on this," and just went and sat with his dog and did other things. It
was so boring that I switched to the For You tab on Twitter.
I'm flying colors to show my unbroken loyalty to the Niners, and my fervent belief that they should trade what's left of Josh Johnson after that fucking spectacular fail last night.
Yeah, trade a guy. Yeah, they'll get a lot for him.
Yeah.
The other thing that happened, this was last night that made me think of you, Scott. I went to amateur night at one of the local comedy clubs to see a friend who's there. I got mocked endlessly by the MC, but it made me think that you got some good jokes, Scott. You should try amateur night. It's actually pretty good.
It's obviously a bad night at amateur night. You had Kory thinking, "Hey, Scott could do this."
Exactly. This is me doing amateur night. Okay. Herle and I got tried. Remember we went to pizza one night, and then halfway through our meal, the waiter came over and he said, "Yeah, this place turns into a comedy club in about 20 minutes." As it turns out, they were wrong, because after the second...
People started trying to tell jokes in 20 minutes, but it certainly wasn't a comedy club.
Savagely bad. Savagely bad. That's exactly when you start thinking, "Hey, I ought to be able to do this." No.
All right, guys. Let's start with some late-breaking news this weekend of an open letter to Ontario Green leader Mike Schreiner from a group of Liberals, some very prominent, asking him to run for the Liberal leadership in Ontario. Outrage ensued from the other leadership contenders. Some Liberals seem offended or insulted by it. Some non-Liberals see it as a silly, desperate play. I also noticed on Twitter that there was a number of people, perhaps less active in politics, who thought it was an interesting idea. Scott, lifelong active Liberal, what do you think?
So these Liberals dislike their dinner so much they've started to lean over and eat off of somebody else's plate. Is that what we're to think? What do you got there? What do you got? Is that... Is that cheese? Could I taste that? I hate it. I think it's pathetic and desperate. I think that it signals more desperation than the party should feel. I think it signals weakness, where the party should be thinking to itself, there's the potential for great strength here. So what's our problem? And, I'm sorry to be a jerk about it, but Greg Sabera, a year or two ago, he was saying his great idea for the Liberal Party was to merge it with the New Democratic Party. Now, this is his second idea, is that, no, let's not merge with the NDP. Let's instead just borrow the Green leader. This guy's a fucking bad idea machine. So, just pull his cord out, okay? I've had enough. I'll take it seriously for a second to go through this. And this is why, like, without getting into, let's just run through it for 1 second. Let's talk about Mike Schreiner, right? You, friend of the pod, decent guy, really likable guy. Is he from the 905 where the Liberals need to make inroads against the Conservatives? No. Is he in the 416 where the Liberals have to fight tooth and nail to hang on to what they've got and maybe avoid any further losses from downtown Marit Stiles leading the NDP now? No. Is he of a new generation? Is he a person of color? Does he bring some other demographic into the fold? Not particularly. He's a middle-aged white guy. And so I like Mike Schreiner. I like Mike Schreiner right where he is. I think that Mike Schreiner is, a thoughtful, decent, properly motivated guy, but he's not the answer. So set aside all those kind of pissy arguments. Well, he's not a lifelong liberal and he hasn't, and all that kind of, he's just not the answer. So if that's it, if you're going to get desperate, fucking like Gary Cherone for Van Halen, that's desperate. Okay. Like, don't just at least grab somebody that, has fronted a rock band. So I just don't, to me, this is bad on every level. And I really think it just looks pathetic and stupid, to say nothing of the fact that the current potential crop of leaders, from whom we haven't really heard, we've seen no game from any of them. How do we know they're terrible? How do we know there aren't other people? How do we know there isn't somebody with some celebrity juice that might be willing to come into this race? Why would you say, this is so gruesome, before we've even given these people a listen, before we've even looked under the carpet to see who else might be lurking, let's just go get this guy who doesn't meet minimum mandatory requirements as far as I'm concerned in terms of enriching Liberal Party circles. And as you've said over and over and over again, David, the Liberal brand in Ontario, going up against a two-term government, there's a lot of opportunity there, man. It's literally a leader away from being more than competitive for government. And I just think, this is just half-baked and awful and pathetic and dreadful. And I would burn the letter if I saw it.
Kory, if Mike Schreiner had been leading the provincial Liberals in the last election, would the result have been different?
No, I don't think so. I think possibly even worse. I just don't get it at all, and it's a lot more than Greg Sorbera. Deb Matthews. That's not a person from the distant past. She's a smart person. That's what and she's somebody who's been in a position of authority a lot more recently within your party. So I just the names on the list are pretty jarring, the seniority of them and the number of them. But for the electoral coalition, and I think the issues that the Liberals have provincially, I just don't see how he's a solution to any of it. As you guys pointed out, there's two fronts for the Liberal Party provincially. There's to try to fight back against NDP in the 416, and then the 905. Got to do a lot better. And Guelph ain't Brampton. It isn't Durham region. It's not Peel. The sort of spectrumy, green stuff that Schenner's selling is not going to sell well in places that are stuck in gridlock or who are struggling with cost of living stuff. It's narratively the wrong thing. But to speak to narrative, I think what the Liberal Party provincially is missing more than a leader is a narrative, a clear narrative as to what it is they're going to offer to voters to make life better. I know it. Ford's narrative is very clear. He's going to build a province. He's going to create jobs. He's going to get stuff done. Right? There is a.
In fairness, that often comes from the leader, right?
But agenda can. But if you had to pick one of the two, I would take a no name with a narrative. Than somebody who's familiar, but with a narrative that isn't going to grow your voter coalition. And I think that's the issue. And Schenner, everybody seems to like him. Not a lot of people voted for him. He got less than 6%, just a hair less than 6%, but it's not like, wow, this guy is at 12, or something like that. I don't think there's enough votes sitting with the Greens right now, even if he were to able to bring some with him, that they aren't offset by people falling out the other end of the coalition, because not everyone who's a Liberal voter is comfortable with that level of echo enthusiasm. So I just don't see how it makes sense at all. I'm just perplexed, frankly, how so many smart, experienced people within the provincial Liberal Party who have, they ruled the province for 10 of the last 15 years. Like it's really perplexing to me how you could come up with an idea this fucking stupid.
Does it change your mind at all if he agrees?
No, I just don't see how how that mathematics works out. Like, I would be, if it were me advising, I'd be looking for a Sandra Pupatello-esque candidate, somebody who's going to go after Ford's burgeoning growth in private sector organized labor, somebody who looks like a little bit more in touch with economic issues and affordability issues. Like I think that's where the most votes that are out there that are in flux are. I don't think you're going to out-woke a downtown New Democrat in terms of the 416, and I don't think you need to as the Liberal Party. Victory is in the suburbs; it's not in the core.
Yeah, just to stick with you for a sec, Kory, do you think that the Liberal Party is desperate enough to be doing this kind of activity?
Well, they clearly feel that way, or a lot of them feel that way. I just think it's wrong. I think it's wrong-headed. But there surely to God, there are other people within the Liberal family in the province of Ontario that you could compel to run if you had that number of senior folks pushing on them. It just seems like a weird place to be focusing the recruitment efforts. There are a lot of Liberals in this province, and you just got to find one that's going to offer something that is different than what the NDP are selling right now. Because I don't think there's enough votes, and as I say, the downtown woke crowd are, they're there, but there's just not enough of them.
I don't think a Shriner is woke, to be fair. I don't think it's that kind of part of the complexion. I do think one thing that's interesting is, and I've made this comment in the federal context, in terms of the narrative of what the Liberal brand is about. It just makes me wonder whether increasingly in 2023, in this particular decade, that one of the central foundations is its commitment to climate policy. Because I struggle. I sort of say, well, we're going to borrow the Green leader. Like, when you look at what's the defining and motivating policy driver of the federal Liberals under Trudeau, right? I don't think you go through too many issues before you hit climate. And it seems to be a lens through which they put a lot of economic and other priority decisions. And I think similarly, it just betrays a little bit of an impulse of folks going, oh, well, let's fortify on that front. So I don't know that that's what it is. But it's just
that only makes sense, Scott. That only makes sense prospectively. Like, if you were to say to yourself, okay,
I agree,
things are going to continue to deteriorate in terms of climate. That issue is going to continue to get more and more salient, and people will be looking for more and more serious solutions. We should put down our flag now, get this guy, position ourselves for that eventuality. You have to be looking at it prospectively for that to make any sense, because I'm sure Kory's going to back me up on this when I say that at the moment, climate is a second tier at best vote motivator.
That would be my counter argument. I'm just making the observation that, and I don't even know if there's enough rigor, the level of rigor that you just articulated behind it, but it just feels to me like it's interesting that climate so seems to dominate the DNA of the federal Liberal Party right now. And then I noticed this, just on the surface of it, reaching for a Green leader. I wonder about that. I wonder if there's some kind of increasing impulse among the so-called, branded L Liberal to say, okay, well, let's start with climate. And I go, actually, let's start with the economy. Okay.
Yeah. Or healthcare. There are 12, 15 points of voters that environment, scores as a top tier issue for pretty consistently. Shinner's sitting on 6 of that, but the Green Party is going to sit on 6 of that probably no matter what. And so you're fighting over such a small number of voters. Like healthcare, that's the number one issue right now by far. Why not get somebody who's a hospital CEO or somebody who has some chops on that side of the issue matrix? If you're the Liberals, that would make a lot more sense to me. But as you say, climate, it's just there's not enough fish in that pond.
Yeah. Last week in this space, we were extolling the virtues of something you probably don't think about very much or at all, but has the potential to greatly impact how you go about your life. Or maybe you do spend significant time thinking about the differences in wireline cabling, and you have considered what it says about providers in this country who stake our connectivity on fast, durable fiber optic cables versus those who just double down on older, cheaper, weaker copper. In order to provide the best network resiliency and reliability, our presenting sponsor Telus builds differently than many of their biggest competitors. Making the switch to fiber optic cables is a big part of that. Because, let's face it, rewiring the country ain't no small thing. They're 70% of the way there already, and 100% fiber optic is the goal. Last week I was talking about how fiber cable makes connectivity faster and more efficient, and won't degrade like copper. So it's far more resistant to extreme weather events, which, we're having a lot of these days. But there's also a sustainability story here, a hell of a persuasive one. Telus Pure Fiber is up to 85% more energy efficient than copper because it requires far less energy to send data over fiber than copper wires. Fiber optic cables are made from silicon dioxide, one of the most abundant elements on the planet. You find it in rocks and sand and water. Copper, on the other hand, is laborious. It's a finite resource that has to be mined. On that subject, it's important to know that, as part of Telus's copper retirement program, all copper wires removed from communities will be recycled. That'll reduce future mining efforts and put less stress on the environment. All of this adds up to Telus Pure Fiber being Canada's most sustainable internet technology, hurly-burlyites. More reliability, more resilience, and more sustainability, wound up in every single strand of it. All right, we'll move on to the great relief of all those listeners and viewers out there that are not obsessed with the Ontario Liberal Party. Poilievre and Trudeau were at it again this week. Battling messages. Our cursed clipping from John Ibbotson is about some particularly barbed back and forths. He writes, when Susan Delacourt of the Toronto Star asked the Prime Minister in an interview why he thought so many people disliked him, he started out sounding sympathetic, if condescending, to those who carry flags bearing an epithet with his name. They may think it's about me, but it's not about me, he replied. It's about the fact that the world is changing in really unpredictable and sometimes scary ways that people don't feel they're part of. But then he started slagging Mr. Poilievre. He's saying everything's broken, Mr. Trudeau says. He's playing and preying on the kinds of anger and anxieties about some Canada that used to be, where men were men and white men ruled. The Prime Minister accused the Leader of the Opposition of pandering to sexists and racists. Sunny ways. Mr. Poilievre was quick to up the ante. This from a guy who dressed up in racist costumes so many times he can't even remember them all, he declared in a video addressed to Mr. Trudeau. He also referenced the resignation of Jody Wilson-Raybould. That's your ugly racist past. This is the kind of no-holds-barred rhetoric you'd expect in a polity so divided that neither side is able to speak to the other, such as is happening tragically between Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Now, there was more to the back and forth between the two leaders than just that particularly sharp exchange. Trudeau spoke to his cabinet retreat and talked about meeting the moment as an expression. I'd like to explore what that means perhaps a little bit. And Poilievre is starting to expand the policy reach of things. He's talking about Indigenous affairs a little bit, talking more about the economy in some different ways. So there's a lot going on in positioning between these two. Kory, who do you think is having a better outing so far? And based on what you saw last week, who's got a more solid positioning?
Well, I don't like either of them. on this front. Like I think it's versions of the same problematic play. I think they both have negatives that are too high as a leader. I think there's something that's unlikable that is holding Poilievre back, and with particularly female voters. And I think when you're on the attack in a very harsh way, yes, you can hurt your opponent by drawing those comparisons and distinctions, but it drives your negatives up in the process. And I think he's got to be looking at trying to soften his appeal. So I think those attacks need to happen. I just don't think Pierre's the best person to be delivering those lines. And I would say the exact same thing for Trudeau. Like I think for a number of voters, the superheated rhetoric that he was throwing out in the last election campaign and aiming at people who disagreed with him on pandemic policy, or the kind of rhetoric he's throwing out at Poilievre right now, I think it's unbecoming to a lot of voters, and I think it's off his political brand. I think Trudeau was doing much better when he was more sunny ways and more likable to some of these voters that are in play right now. So I don't think it's working well for either one. I think it's sort of pandering to your core voters a little bit. Your core voters are always going to like that level of sharpness in your rhetoric, but it's off-putting for others. So I think they should both, as Scott has suggested, I think correctly in the past, find a attack dog within their caucus who can go out every day and make these points and pound away on the other leader, but try to save a more positive, hopeful vision for themselves to deliver. It's not like you're not going to deliver some attacks. I just think you got to nerf the amount of personal mudslinging if you want to increase your likability rating.
So, Scott, campaigns, to Kory's point, campaigns that we've worked on, we've always wanted to keep the attacks out of the leader's mouth and have the leader articulate the positive vision and have the attacks come from somewhere else. And it takes me to a couple of questions about this. First of all, sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you won't be able to land an attack unless the leader says it, because the media won't take it seriously coming from some other source. But it also makes me wonder about why they are so willing to have Trudeau out of his own mouth call Poilievre a racist and a sexist and not run negative ads against the guy.
Just on that I'm going to pick up on one thing. It's in Ibbitson's column and it's in your question, and I want to zero in on it. Not that it's the whole of this issue, but I don't think Trudeau calls him a sexist and a racist in the sense that explicitly he does not use those words. Whereas if you take a look, literally multiple times, Poilievre will characterize Trudeau and making reference to blackface directly or indirectly and call it racist. And I think that's a real mistake. I think literally unwrapping that word would be a mistake if Trudeau was saying it explicitly, and is a mistake for Poilievre. I think arguably it's even a graver mistake for Poilievre because he's still in the character and identity formation period of his time as a political leader. People are still trying to learn who he is and find out about him, and I'm not sure that's one of the takeaways they want. I think that it's a signal to a bunch of people that's a bridge too far. That's a tone that's too harsh. That's a word that makes me gives me an aversion. I think you can see that. My overall thing is I sort of strongly agree with everything that we're all sort of saying, and I've said it before. I think that Trudeau ought not to carry his own hammer. I think that he ought to hand it off to someone. I'll explicitly say that if there's evidence of a strategy here, it's unobvious to me. I think we have evidence of a prime minister and a leader who both want to say these things, who want to mix it up. I think that's what's going on. And that could be one of the most awkward circumstances, is that when you're advising somebody and you turn to the prime minister and you say, well, don't say everything isn't broken. Don't say Mr. Poilievre has got this all wrong and that, he's pandering to the worst impulses and all that. Let's take somebody phenomenally talented as a communicator and let them be your second. Let them be the designated hitter. We'll tell the media that they're designated. And the leader says, or the prime minister says, I don't want to. No, they won't hear it unless I say it. And so I'm going to do it. So I don't know if that's a dynamic, but it feels like possibly that's a dynamic. But they have to fix that, in my view. Mark Gerritsen tweeting at Pierre Poilievre isn't a sufficient response, right? We've got the prime minister on the one hand, right? The biggest, loudest liberal in the land, right? Saying things that deviate from his character definition that he's always wanted to have. And you got Mark Gerritsen, backbench MP, whatever, talented guy, all that kind of stuff. But backbench MP, not loud enough. They need Goldilocks, okay? We need a Goldilocks solution. They need somebody in the middle, and they need to say, this cabinet minister, right, is our go-to person. They are, in addition to their responsibilities as a member of the cabinet, they are our designated political puncher. So if you, Globe and Mail or Toronto Star or CBC or CTV are looking for someone to get quote on Poilievre and you want to meet his fire with fire, then you go to that person. And then you say to the prime minister, we have a strategy. We have a spokesperson. We've conditioned the media. They know who it is. It will show up. It is showing up. You don't have to do it and don't do it. And then, as you say, David, for the love of God, run some negative ads. If you're willing to hammer on this, then, put money behind it and try to leave a mark. Don't pretend that you're virtuous because you haven't said it in an ad. You've only said it, using the prime minister? That's nonsensical and counterproductive.
Kory, there's something that interests me about the dialogue between these two guys, and it relates to the use of two examples from their past. So the Liberals don't talk about Poilievre without talking about his advice to buy Bitcoin. And Poilievre doesn't talk about Trudeau without talking about blackface. They seem to think they can break his brand with blackface if they bring it back and put it in front of people's. What do you think about that? What do you think about those two examples as the unfitness of the other?
Well, I think if blackface was sufficient to break his brand, then Andrew Scheer would be prime minister. But it's not new information, and I don't think it's in and of itself sufficient. I think what's more damning about Trudeau is the attacks that he has made on other Canadians that disagree with him, and he hasn't consistently done this, but he's done it on enough occasions and in a high-profile enough way that I think that is a better thing to focus in on. This is like Hillary Clinton's deplorables comment. When it ceases to be so clearly focused on the candidate, and it looks like it's more like the people who support the other party or something, and you're trying to denormalize them, I think that's a much more problematic and vulnerable area for him. And he's delved into that enough times that I think you could land that attack with some effect. With blackface, it's speaks to something that is obviously an embarrassing and indefensible part of Trudeau's past, but it's not new, and it's been used a bunch of times before, and it gets your core supporters cheering and clapping, but I don't know. I just don't think it's the right one to be putting out there.
But they seem to think it's a shield to Trudeau's allegations of racism against Poilievre, to just fire that back and say, you have no right to call me a racist. You did blackface.
Sure. It's an attempt to parry the blow, but I just think they're better. I'm not sure that that is the right parry. I think pointing to his own family. This is someone who's in a marriage with someone who's a visible minority, and clearly does not hold racism in his heart. And like that, for him to do so would be to be in sort of violation of everything that's obvious in his own personal life. So, and it would serve to highlight what I think one of his greatest strengths are potentially is to point to his family, and it kind of takes him out of the politician role and makes him have a little more nuance on his profile and his brand. I thought his wife's speech after winning leadership was one of the smartest and most effective things that he's done since becoming leader. And more of that is going to help him more than I think pointing out blackface.
So there's this Canadian documentary on the Discovery Channel called Highway Through Hell. It follows a BC company that specializes in rescuing really big trucks and other heavy vehicles that are overwhelmed by the ferocious environment of BC's interior. Mudslides, washouts, lethal drop-offs, avalanches, rock falls, that sort of thing. The heroes of Highway Through Hell recover giant rigs that have plunged off precipices, or drag marooned excavators out of peat bogs, or haul some behemoth out of a sea of mud. What viewers may not notice, though, is what goes on in the background. As the wrecking crews struggle with their Sisyphean tasks along the highway through hell, from time to time a train slides smoothly from one side of the frame to the other, behind them, either heading for or out of Vancouver. The fact is, trains have been navigating the BC interior for more than a century. Railways know the terrain and weather better than anyone. Our sponsor, CN, has an entire force of engineers and other specialists whose job is to keep trains running. Unlike the Highway Through Hell crews, though, they specialize in ensuring disasters are cleared before trains roll through. Their ability to respond when nature's hammer falls is remarkable. And then there's just common sense. CN and its main competitor compete, to be sure, but sometimes they cooperate in harsh environments, sharing tracks and even trains. In the Fraser Canyon, both CN and CP trains use each other's tracks on either side of the river to ensure smooth flow of cargo and on-time delivery. And that's just one example. Hauling cargo through wilderness can be hairy, and when there is a business case for cooperation between railways, it happens, as it must. That, though, is a much different thing than regulated cooperation imposed by government. CN knows its business better than anyone. Left to its own ends, it moves Canada's economy on time and safely.
Look, execution is 9/10 of the law of communications. And if you don't want someone to think of the word racist when they see you, don't say the word racist. If it's a strategy to parry and all that stuff, I just would never, ever, ever put that word in Pierre Poilievre's mouth if I was working with him, and I wouldn't permit him to say it. I'd have a swear jar. I would have the strap. I'd do whatever it takes to get that out of him. The last thing I would say on this subject is there's one thing I like about it a lot. Okay? There's one thing I really, really like about this dynamic between them. It is convincing me, right, that they honestly don't like one another. It is convincing me that they are honestly motivated to pound one another. It is convincing me that the Prime Minister is for certain going to stay and fight the next election. And as a Liberal partisan, I believe it is a fundamental precondition to success, not a guarantee of success, but a precondition to success, that Trudeau takes them into the next election. Otherwise, I think—
What about Elizabeth May?
I think that's a good idea. Maybe, again, I go back to it. Maybe Sammy Hagar. Let's try all of the replicate, the second-rate singers for Van Halen. But I think to the degree to which winning seats in Quebec is a precondition to electoral success of the next campaign, Trudeau is absolutely necessary for the federal Liberals. And if being driven to beat Pierre Poilievre and all what he believes Pierre Poilievre represents as a school of politics, hallelujah. I'll put up with some snappy words and angry comebacks if it keeps him in the saddle, because I think he's fundamental to the Liberals' electoral prospects in the next election.
Well, while we're talking about him and words that come out of people's mouths, he said something that made me laugh, and that is, we are going to meet this moment. This moment. Scott, have you ever worked with a leader in politics who didn't think that the time that they were in office was a uniquely pivotal, decisive period in history of Canada, if not the world?
If I had $1 for every leader that's asked me to write, this election may be the most consequential of our lifetime, right? This moment, this magic moment. It's just, of course, right? I mean, there's a sensibility to it, right? You got to establish their stakes and all that sort of stuff. But it's also one of the things that people hate about politicians. They're always sort of like, I'm putting myself in the middle of the greatest drama of all time, right? This is like, will Troy fall, right? Like, I'm here. So it's, yeah, I mean, that's why I really think, by the way, that there are some things that harm some politicians more than others. I think using the word racist by Poilievre is really bad. I think all that highfalutin kind of, conceptual bullshit from Trudeau, we must meet this moment. We must, aspire to meet our aspirations. I hate all that shit. I think that's the exact opposite. He needs hard work, delivering stuff, saying, listen, here's a file. I've closed it. Move on. Here's the next file. Look at this. I'm closing this one. I'm getting shit done. I'm getting things accomplished. I'm unfucking things that were fucked. I think that's where they got to be. Not we're going to meet this moment. We're going to be grand in our grandiosity. I just hate all that shit.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because you brought this up in talking about Quebec, and I'm really perplexed by this. What is Trudeau doing throwing down a marker on Section 33 in Quebec this late in the life of his government after having let that go for so long? I don't get the play at all, and I agree with you, Scott. Quebec is central to the re-election efforts of Trudeau. What is he thinking going to war with Legault on this issue, which has been out there for so long? I don't understand what the play is.
In which the numbers in Quebec are 90-10.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, I might like it as what he's doing as a person, because I disagree with those Quebec laws, and I wish that they had been struck down by the charter, and I would like Trudeau to do something. But politically, it's extremely dangerous. It's also interesting that they brought it up in the middle of what is apparently the closing of the healthcare negotiations.
Yeah, I just don't understand what the play is. Like, I understand you Liberals all have a bizarre fetish around the notwithstanding clause, but
I like to put it in a brassiere.
I know,
that really gets my blood pumping.
Dressed up in a little red teddy and parade around. Like, it's so nutty. In terms of a political strategy, to me, anyway. But
that's why you're not a Liberal.
I also don't know Quebec politics as well as many other people out there. But I do read polling, and as you say, like, the support for its use in Quebec is off the charts. So I think I can think of two things. First of all, look how quickly this pot has slid into the ditch, right? No Jordan, and we're talking about dressing the notwithstanding clause up and fucking it. Okay, this is a commercial for not having all male panels. But I would say there's two potential explanations for it. I'm just shooting the shit here. One is it may be evidence of what we're talking about earlier. Like, I mean, Trudeau's been prime minister for a number of years. I don't know. In my observation, once people have been prime minister for a certain duration of time, they start to say, I'm going to fucking do what I fucking want sometimes, right? And there starts to be a little bit of that. And this isn't the first time Trudeau has mentioned it. It may be one of the more forceful times, but he's been consistent in indicating he has been delicate in how he's deployed the issue, but he's been sort of consistent on what he thinks and what his personal view is, and he's being more forceful here. So I think it could just be that. It could be that this is a strain that we should watch. There's a little bit of a thread of, Trudeau's just saying, look, I'm the leader. The second thought is if they're trying to intellectualize it and turn it into a strategy. I mean, there is that Andre Pratt argument that, you sometimes refer to, David, where, there's, and we're all vastly underqualified to have this discussion because it's a fundamentally a Quebecois discussion, but that there's an expert that Quebecers will say of a federal leader and of a federal prime minister, I will tolerate views even if they're in contradiction to my own personal, provided I think and expect that's something that I ought to hear out of a prime minister. And provided they're a Quebecer, then I will. Then that kind of fits into the puzzle piece of what I'm looking for in a prime minister. So it's a little bit like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, right? Could hammer away in the way that he did throughout all those years and still win virtually every seat in Quebec. So I wonder if there's.
He never faced the bloc. It's a big difference.
I appreciate that, but I'm trying to come up with the answers. Those are two that strike me.
So if you're a long-term or even medium-term planner, you tend to want to make sure you have enough of the really vital stuff in life, well, before you run out of it. Regular listeners can guess what that stuff would be for me. Hint, it starts with an R and ends with an M, and there's only one other letter. For Canada, shipping container capacity qualifies as really vital stuff, as many of the goods we all rely on move in and out of the country in containers. Our sponsor is the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and we've been talking the last little while about how they're proposing to build a brand new marine terminal for shipping containers at the Port of Vancouver, Roberts Bank Terminal 2. Because container capacity on the West Coast is quickly diminishing, because trade needs are only growing in Canada, and the Port of Vancouver is a critical gateway for Canada's trade. Because it will strengthen the link between our country's businesses, big and small, and the global economy. Because the economic impact will be 17,300 well-paying jobs and $3 billion in additional GDP annually during terminal operations. And because, frankly, we've all had it up to here with supply chain issues, so scaling up right away will help connect Canadians with goods when they need them. But there's another key aspect to the long-term planning of this critical port project for Canada I want to talk about. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's vision is for the Port of Vancouver to be the world's most sustainable port. And one way they're focusing on meeting that vision is by working with all their partners to build a zero-emission port by 2050. You heard me right, the entire port community. Building and supporting low-emission tech initiatives in an effort to phase out all port-related emissions by 2050 is part of that vision and supports the government's goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority has a proven track record of building sustainable infrastructure projects, all while being a trusted partner of government, business, Indigenous groups, and local communities to get the job done. All right, so our last topic for today is a nasty one. Crime in the city of Toronto there's been a wave of very disturbing incidents in the last couple of weeks, many of them on the transit system, but not all of them on the transit system. In an article in the Globe, Marcus G. said things are spinning out of control in Toronto, which to my mind sounded a bit like everything is broken. And when you get civil society reinforcing what your political message is, you're in a pretty solid spot. Kory, what are the federal political implications of a crime spree in Toronto?
Well, I think it's not good. Crime is one of these areas that conservatives hold such a strong issue advantage on consistently over time in almost every jurisdiction, probably in every jurisdiction, actually. It's hard for them to push back, because just the fact that it's in the window and being talked about at all is bad news. I think the type of crimes that are occurring are also problematic, as there's one area where the Liberals can score some points on the Conservatives, and they're trying to do so with Marco Mendicino's maybe ham-fisted, maybe intentional tweaking of their gun control legislation. Suburban voters and urban voters in Ontario agree with the Liberal Party when it comes to gun control. They don't agree with me. I'm for the private ownership of tactical nuclear weapons, so I'm way outside the norms on this stuff. But everyone else who votes is overwhelmingly not with me here. But this isn't gun crime. This is people getting stabbed with syringes. This is people getting pushed off the subway platform. This is rampant carjackings in Peel region. These are things that are not gun crime, and so I think their go-to policy to try to get a win out of a difficult topic area, isn't there for them in the way that it would be if this was a wave of gang shootings. Which we've seen those happen before, and so I think it's not just bad news that it's an issue and it's out there. I think it's one that's in an area where they don't have their go-to answer that shifts things more on a more favorable territory for themselves.
Your reading of the polling. I just want to confirm your reading of the polling. I mean, I think over time it's been crystal clear that when people are worried about crime, they're more likely to vote Conservative than when they're not worried about crime.
Well, I would be out there if I were Poilievre, joining the premiers on bail reform. I think that's from a policy perspective, low hanging fruit. I think there's more complicated conversations, especially when it comes to violence on the TTC, in that it's more closely associated with mental health policy and addiction policy than it is crime policy. This isn't people being mugged as much as it is people who are in a really troubled mental state who are acting out in ways that are violent and very dangerous and very problematic. But the answers to this stuff is probably more nuanced. Carjackings, that's not nuanced. Letting people out, who have dangerous offenses on very loose bail conditions, that's not difficult to understand. And so I think there's some really good stuff that Poilievre can put in the window. You could look at, what is prison capacity? I think that this is another part of what's going on. But there's some good policy planks that you could put in a platform if you're a Poilievre to really try to continue to pull on this thread, because I think you can unravel a lot of the liberal sweater with this thread in the GTA.
Scott, I think that there are some things that the Liberals ran on in 2015 that they think were important to their victory, but in my view, they actually won in spite of. And one of them is getting rid of mandatory minimum sentencing. That was in the platform, and it's been a dispute inside the government ever since 2015, as some people were aggressively pushing that agenda and other people were a little nervous about it politically. But whatever the policy merits one way or another, that's not a popular policy. People think there are certain offenses for which there should be a significant amount of jail time. And so running against mandatory minimums and this sort of catch and release thing that opponents are catching on to feels to me dangerous for the government.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think this is a very dangerous subject for the government, more dangerous than I think maybe they necessarily appreciate. I think this is where, all parties have, their own biases and blinders. And I think this is one where they maybe let themselves down. I think I've heard people inside this government say, well, listen, we got to be doing this mandatory minimum and bail reform discussion kicks off. We got to be really careful. We can't be off brand. And I think they have to be more careful than that. I think this is almost all defense. And by the way, the complexity of the situation is that it's defense on more than one front. There's definitely defense in terms of the Conservatives. We want to put it in partisan terms, strictly partisan and electoral terms. There's a danger, the catch and release argument that comes from Poilievre and the Conservatives that I think has a lot of traction. And then I think there's a danger also in terms of the other front, because I think that lots and lots and lots of people, even people that are for mandatory minimums and bail reform, recognize that it is a complex problem. Probably a lot of it has to do with crumbling foundations in terms of the supports that we offer for so many people that, why are people getting attacked on the subway? Maybe because there's a shitload more people on the subway because they don't have any place else to go where they feel safe. So they get on it at 6 o'clock in the morning and then they ride it and then they're disturbed and it erupts in horrifying ways. And that's not all circumstances, but it's some of it. So they've got to be mindful that, of the NDP picking that up and really making a lot of traction with that side of the ledger. I think the fundamental reality right now is that the Liberals need shielding on this issue. I wouldn't try to go on offense and talk about up here. Poilievre doesn't know. Let him walk himself into a trap if he wants to be too simplistic on it and look like he's being exploitative. But I wouldn't fool myself into believing there's an opportunity here. And I don't think that you can look like you're being responsive on these more complex roots of crimes issue unless you first take some action on bail reform. And I think they need to take some action on bail reform in order to give themselves permission to spend 80% of the time talking about the roots of crime discussion where they feel more comfortable and where they think they need to in order to hold off NDP encroachment in large urban areas. But if they don't put up the shielding of bail reform, I think they're going to create real political problems for themselves, because this catch and release stuff, you guys know I do talk radio, and I know that maybe that twists my lens a bit, but it's downtown Toronto, right? Not downtown Calgary, not rural Alberta, and people are freaked out in the city right now. and they are freaked out about the subway. And moms won't let their kids go on the subway, and young professional working women do not want to ride the subway. And I don't think the Liberal answer can be, we need 100 years war on poverty and homelessness.
Right.
That's true, but that's not an adequate, and it's certainly not an immediate response. They got to get themselves shielding on bail reform.
There's a municipal overlay on this too that I think has an interesting dynamic. There's always a bit of an interplay between the mayor of Toronto as the sort of the loudest voice in the GTA, and then federal and provincial politicians. And I think, despite the fact that John Tory has been the most popular politician in the GTA now for quite some time by a substantial margin, I think he's very vulnerable on this. I think he played a lot of footsie around, with some of the defund the police crowd, cut the number of officers. There hasn't been much of a presence in terms of security on the transit system for some time, and it's decreased over time, and now it's going to go the other direction in response to this. But I think he has some culpability in what's going on politically. I think he has some exposure politically on it. And I think he likes being popular. I think he's gonna enter the fray here and help keep this in the headlines by going after various levels of government.
Well, his first response was a police response, right? Not a oh, well, what are we going to do about mentally ill people on the streets, and how do we get them back? How do we find them?
In fairness, he said both, but with an emphasis on the former, not the latter. So it's I think it's a big issue. It's a big issue for on the financial side too. TTC ridership, transit ridership, is way down. And it was way down because of the pandemic. It's not way down because of the pandemic now. It's way down because of public safety concerns. And this year's request for a bailout for the transit system is $750 million. It's not small. And so the largest financial asset that the city has of the federal government and the province is related to this. So it's too big to go away. This isn't just some perception issue that people have around crime. This is something that is driving some really big numbers on the budget side of things too. So I think you can't avoid it. I agree with you, Scott. If I were the Liberals, I'd be trying to play defense and be a bit proactive about it. But I wouldn't be then going on to talk about the root causes of crime. I'd be going on to talk about healthcare or something else where you can get some traction with voters. But it's too big to go away, and I think it's a very tough one for these guys.
You can't talk about prevention of crime in an environment where crime is happening. That's not what people want to hear.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got lots of polling on this. Canadians believe we should be doing more on prevention. People believe we should be doing more to help mentally ill people. But people also believe that when you push somebody off the subway, onto the platform, onto the track, that there needs to be a serious consequence for that action. And that any kind of violent crime actually, requires some sort of consequence that would be jail time or something like it. So people are hard asses about this. They don't believe in rehabilitation from some certain types of crime. And so there's just they're offside with liberal orthodoxy on this issue, and we can't get it to the right place. And liberals think that gun control compensates, and it doesn't. Gun control is now a values issue, not a crime issue. The people that are supporting it don't think it's going to reduce crime. They just think it's a better reflection of our society.
Well, I know I sound like an old man. We learned that lesson in 2005 with Jane Kriba.
Yeah.
We thought, well, maybe this will actually create currency for gun control policies, and that's how that issue would unfold. And it is not how that issue unfolded in real time during an election campaign.
Well, jail time, they got to watch out that the perception isn't that prison is only for firearms owners and the unvaccinated, because those are the only people who they seem to want to throw the book at.
All right, on that note, Gordon Pinsent, bring us home, brother.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
By the way, I had Premier Fury from Newfoundland on the Hurly Burly last week, and he was very effusive about the fact that Gordon Pinsent was part of the Curse Politics program. Great Newfoundland presence. All right, who wants to go first with their Hey You?
I'll go first. Scott, you got to go into the afterlife to hear this one, though. I want to put a Hey You out to Hazel McCallion, who I was surprised to see was only 101 when she passed, because it seems like she's been in politics for a lot more than 1 century. But certainly, if not the longest serving and most impactful municipal politician in Ontario, if not Canada. But sorry to see somebody who had such a long and storied career pass. And so to her friends and family, my condolences. And hey, you, Hazel, Hurricane Hazel's in heaven now, I'm sure, giving them hell.
Only person on an airport board who remembered the time before air travel, presumably.
Yes. Yeah. Right. She was there for the discovery of fire and many other important historic.
R.I.P. I admired her work during the Upper Canada Rebellion. My Hey You goes out because I'm always so damn critical and snarky. My Hey You is a positive one for a switch. It's going out to Karina Gold, and I presume PMO Communications. As much as we talk about the Prime Minister, invoking the phrase of Canada isn't broken and back and forth and tonal issues with Pierre Poilievre, I thought at the cabinet retreat they did a really smart thing. I thought that when they put Karina Gold out to have measured, long-form discussion, report out that on passports, they had eliminated the backlog, that they're working at 97% turnaround times, being on schedule, that they know that 10-year renewals are coming up this summer for those longer term passports, and they've got a plan and resources in place to manage that. I thought that was smart. That, to me, is the right response. It isn't saying, fuck off, Pierre, Canada isn't broken, you're broken, your face is broken. It's to say, here's what's working. And, passports has been exhibit number one in this jury trial for the past few months. And I thought it was really smart to go out there, address it directly, demonstrate that you can move the yardsticks on something, and then take a ton of questions and talk about it in a thoughtful, measured, here's the explanation way. I know everybody in the world didn't hear it, but I would use that template over and over and over again and accrue some benefit on this stuff, or at least diminish your vulnerability. So hats off. I thought that was the way to get it done. I thought that it was a good strategy on the PMO Communications part, and I thought it was great execution by Minister Gold, and I would do a lot more of it.
Hey, is Poilievre ever going to have to produce that guy that allegedly missed his wedding?
Yeah,
the Mustafa guy that he said had been waiting for a passport and couldn't get missed his wedding. Oh well.
No, who was he marrying? Maybe it was a good thing. I don't know.
All right, my Hey You goes out to Kirsty Duncan. I don't know her well, but she's I think a very good person, and she's been a very good Liberal MP for a number of years. And she's taking a break for health reasons, and I hope she deals with whatever her problem is, and I hope she gets better. The second thing is, on the way out the door, she made a very compelling plea for better safety for children in organized sports, better protections for young boys and girls from predatory behavior or from just abusive, competitive behavior. And she gave a personal example that was very brave. So my Hey You this week, Kirsty Duncan, get well, and we'll see you back in the House of Commons when you can. All right, everybody, that's our show for this week. I'd like to thank Kory and Scott for being here, and hope Jordan's well wherever she is. I'd like to thank Gordon Pinsent for being with us again today. Thank all of you who watched or listened. Thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsors, CN and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. We'll see you all next week with more Curse of Politics.